Welcome, and prepare to journey back to the shadowed halls of Tudor England, where a whisper of a forgotten queen still echoes.
The cell was cold, not from the stone or the wind, nor even the coming winter, but from the silence that had once been music. Lady Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, sat by the wall with her back straight, hands folded, and face tilted toward the dying light that crept through the barred slit above. She had been a queen's daughter, a prince's sister, a king's cousin, and a lady of the court. Now she was merely a traitor, a prisoner, a problem. Very soon she would be dead.
History would not call her queen, reserving that name for those with crowns, scandals, or blood on their hands. Yet Margaret was undeniably royalty, the last living thread of the Plantagenet line, the final echo of a dynasty that had ruled England longer than memory. This heritage made her dangerous, not for anything she had done, but simply for who she was. The child had not asked to be born into the war of cousins, into the aftermath of kings turned corpses and thrones soaped in red. Her father, George, Duke of Clarence, once heir presumptive to Edward IV, had drowned in a vat of wine before she could walk. Treason, they had said. Madness, whispered others. But Margaret only remembered the profound silence that followed, and the way her mother's hands trembled each time the royal names, Clarence or Plantagenet, were spoken, for they now evoked only fear, never joy. They raised her in the shadow of shame, allowing her to exist, but never to truly thrive. She was too royal to be forgotten, yet too dangerous to be trusted. And yet, through it all, the child survived. She smiled when told, curtsied when commanded, and wore the colours of peace while saying the prayers of obedience. When Henry Tudor, that foreign man of uncertain claim, took the crown as Henry VII, Margaret bowed. When he wed Elizabeth of York to unify the red rose and the white, Margaret stood quietly behind them, watchful like a relic of another age. The Tudors brought peace, but it was the kind of peace that demanded blood in silence. Old enemies disappeared, titles were stripped, and claims were erased. Margaret, now a widow with 5 children and countless debts, found herself playing a game she had never agreed to join. Then, one day, the king gave her a title, a gift, he said, restoring her lands, her dignity, her name. But Margaret knew that when a Tudor gives, it is only to watch more closely what he may one day take.
Her children thrived. That was her sin. Reginald, her brightest, was sent to Oxford, to Italy, to Rome, and came back with ideas that did not wear crowns. He studied the scriptures too closely, spoke of the Pope too fondly. When the second Tudor, Henry VIII, a lion-made man, lust wearing a crown, demanded a divorce, Reginald answered not with silence, but with scripture. "You are not the head of the church," Reginald wrote. "You are a king, not a priest." It was enough to sign his death, but Reginald fled, and Margaret, left behind, was made to pay the cost of words she did not speak.
In the cold corridors of court, they smiled at her, called her Lady of the Robes, friend to Queen Catherine. They even let her raise Princess Mary, The little girl with her mother's eyes and her father's fury. Margaret had loved her like blood, but blood was the very thing that made her dangerous. When the Queen fell, Margaret was dismissed. When the King remarried, Margaret was watched. And when Reginald published a letter calling the King a heretic and tyrant, Margaret's fate was sealed.
They came at dawn. There was no trial, no questions, only a writ signed by hands that trembled behind velvet gloves. Act of Attainder, they called it. Her name was stripped, her titles erased, her lands seized, and her body imprisoned. At 67 years old, Margaret Pole became the oldest woman sentenced to death in Tudor England.
She was not afraid of dying, for she had seen death come for kings and queens, for mothers and sons, but it was the manner of it that gnawed at her. No trial, no testimony, only fear. The king's fear, the fear of bloodlines older than his, the fear of ghosts that wore crowns before he was born. She was to die not for what she had done, but for what she represented, and perhaps that was the worst kind of justice of all.
In the Tower they gave her no priest, no book, only walls. They thought isolation would break her. But Margaret had lived in silence before, as a child after her father's death, as a widow, as a mother left behind. And so she sat and remembered.
She remembered Catherine of Aragon, bent but unbroken, and Mary, the child taught to wear silence like armour. She remembered Reginald, whose words had lit a fire he could not extinguish, and her husband, long dead. Her other sons had vanished in shadow, her daughters married into silence, and she remembered the boy-king she once held, the one who had now become a butcher in silk, Henry, her cousin's son, her friend once, now her executioner.
They did not even bring an axe sharp enough. The executioner was young, nervous, and untrained. They said he struck her 3 times. Some said 5. Others whispered 7. All Margaret Pole knew was the sky above, the cold wind on her neck, and the strange thought that perhaps this, too, was how dynasties ended, not with a battle, but with a blade too dull to finish the job.
The blood had barely dried when the stories began. Not the official kind, penned by clerks in velvet sleeves who moved on after writing traitor, but the other kind that took root, whispered in kitchens, sung half-heartedly by laundresses and widows. They said she refused the blindfold, that she ran around the scaffold, forcing the executioner to chase her, that the axe shattered, that God himself intervened. What mattered wasn't truth, but memory, and Margaret Pole, last of the Plantagenet, had just become a martyr no one dared name.
In the court of Henry VIII, silence returned, but it was a new kind of silence. Not peaceful, not pious, but a silence of breath held too long. It was the silence of courtiers who crossed themselves in private, and of queens who kept their children far from the shadow of old blood. Henry had killed many, but Margaret's death was different. It wasn't war, it wasn't revenge, but raw, choking fear of a woman who had done nothing, who simply existed, and in doing so reminded him he would never be truly king, not while her blood still lingered in the stones of the tower.
Mary remembered. the little girl, now grown, cast aside like her mother before her. Her governors dead, her title stripped, her future erased. They thought Mary would forget, that she would marry where she was told, kneel when commanded. But daughters remember their mothers, and Mary, daughter of Catherine, ward of Margaret, was forged in quiet fire. She carried Margaret's rosary for years, not to pray, but to remember, not forgiveness, but resolve.
In Rome, Reginald wept, not publicly, for cardinals do not weep where others see. But in his chambers the letter shook in his hands. He had written words, letters, condemnations, truths, and England had answered with blood, his mother's blood. The guilt was a blade he would carry the rest of his life. When offered the cardinal's hat, he took it. When offered the legation to England, he refused it. Only when Queen Mary, Margaret's pupil, summoned him did he return, not as a prince or a hero, but as a son looking for absolution he knew he'd never deserve.
Years passed. Tombs were built, names rewritten. Sons became kings, queens became legends. The tower stood as it always had. But there, in a low grave without marker, lay the woman who outlived her title, her bloodline, her justice. They tried to erase her, but they forgot one thing. You cannot kill a symbol.
Centuries later, when Queen Victoria came to the tower, a guide showed her the site, speaking quickly as if embarrassed. That spot there, Countess of Salisbury, executed, Henry VIII. The Queen paused, looked at the stone, then turned to her court and declared, "There should be a memorial. There still isn't, but the whispers remain."
In every story of daughters used, then discarded, in every tale of loyalty mistaken for threat, in every moment when a woman's silence is twisted into guilt, Margaret Pole lives. Some say power is in the sword, some say in the crown, but Margaret knew the truth. Power is in memory, and memory, once set free, cannot be buried, no matter how many blows it takes. She had learned early that affection was dangerous. The first time Margaret reached for her mother's hand in public, a nobleman cleared his throat so loud it shattered the air. Her mother pulled back, smiled tight, and whispered, "Plantagenets do not ask for comfort." That was the lesson, and so Margaret stopped reaching. The court of Henry VII was made of quiet cruelties. Laughter was rationed, smiles were measured, even the candles seemed to burn with restraint. Elizabeth of York, the Tudor queen, was the only one who looked at Margaret like a person and not a problem. They shared the same blood, after all, but one had been married into power, while the other had been born with too much of it. Margaret stood at the edge of every feast, danced only when commanded, and spoke only in sentences pre-approved by etiquette. Every other girl learned embroidery, Margaret learned erasure, but one woman saw her, Catherine of Aragon. The Spanish princess had eyes like no one else at court, warm, unafraid, iron-souled. She was not yet queen then, just a widow left on the strange, damp island, a dowry contested, her future uncertain. Margaret had walked past her garden once, when Catherine looked up, smiled, and said, "You look like a queen." Margaret had laughed, replying, "I'm not even a lady." "Not yet," Catherine replied, then, almost as an afterthought, added, "But you carry yourself like one, as if your silence is your crown."
Years later, when Catherine became queen, she summoned Margaret. "I will need someone to watch over Mary," she said, clarifying, "a shield." And so Margaret became Lady Governess to the little girl with the soft curls and the serious eyes, Mary Tudor. Mary had been born into love and expectation, the daughter of the king, the light of England. But even as an infant, Margaret could sense the unease that gathered around her like storm clouds. The court loved Mary, but not too much. The council praised her, but never without caveats. And the king, Henry VIII, loved her most when she was quiet. Margaret knew this pattern. It was the same dance her father had once done with the York brothers, with Clarence, with her. Love in royal bloodlines was a transaction, and daughters were always overdrawn. Mary clung to Margaret as she grew, clung the way orphans do, even when their parents still lived. Catherine was always busy with prayers, diplomacy, and the struggle to stay relevant in a kingdom that shifted with every whim of a man who believed himself chosen by God, and therefore incapable of sin. Margaret taught Mary how to read Latin, how to ride, and how to navigate silence. But most importantly, she taught her how to survive without certainty. "Do not beg," she once told her while braiding the child's hair. "Do not cry for justice. It won't come." "What do I do instead?" Mary asked. "Remember," Margaret said, "and wait." When Anne Boleyn came, everything changed. Not all at once, but slowly, like poison. Margaret saw it before Catherine did, not because she was cleverer, but because she had lived through it before. She saw how the king's eyes strayed, how the queen's invitations stopped arriving, how letters were no longer delivered in hand, but by guards. When the king created himself head of the church, Margaret did not speak, but she watched as Catherine was dismissed from court, watched as Mary was declared a bastard, watched as her own role was reduced to a technicality.
She went to Mary's room the day the title changed. The girl sat in a plain dress, staring out the window, not speaking. "Your Grace," Margaret said, bowing, only to be immediately corrected by a steward behind her. "She is no longer styled Grace." Margaret turned, asserting, "I was not speaking to you." She stayed even as it became dangerous, even as Anne demanded all old blood be purged from the princess's household, and even as Henry looked at Margaret with a new kind of suspicion, not for what she had done, but for who she reminded him of. One morning a letter came. Dismissal with no reason, no appeal. She went to Mary's room one last time. The girl stood when she entered. "I'll be sent away," Mary said, trying not to cry. "They want to break me." "You are a Tudor," Margaret said quietly. "But more than that, you are your mother's daughter." Margaret looked up and affirmed, "And yours." Margaret did not correct her. Back in her own home, Margaret walked her halls like a ghost. She lit candles every night for the living, never the dead. The worst had not yet come, but she could feel it approaching, like a shadow stretching across the threshold. She wrote Reginald once, telling him to be careful, to say less, to be less. He replied with Latin verses and talk of papal debates. Margaret burned the letter, knowing the next would come with her son's name on it, but written in blood. Cardinal Reginald Pole, traitor to the crown. His mother, suspected accomplice. His family, to be watched. Margaret read it once,
then twice, then said simply, "It begins." The walls did not close in all at once. They leaned, they listened. It began with a steward no one remembered hiring, then a priest who watched more than he prayed, then a cousin who stopped writing back.
Margaret felt them peeling away, not enemies, but friends too afraid to be seen standing still when the wind changed direction. The king had not condemned her, but he no longer looked at her, which in Henry's England was the same thing. She kept walking the halls of her estate in Warblington like a duchess, not because she still believed she was, but because someone had to remember the shape of dignity. Her servants learned to speak softer. Her children sent shorter letters, and when guests came, they did not stay for supper.
The worst silence was from Reginald. At first it was not silence at all, but fire. Letters blazing with scripture, with papal rhetoric, with righteous fury. He condemned Henry's divorce, then Henry's new church, then Henry himself. From Rome he wrote of England like a man describing a house that had already burned down. "You are the last honest pillar left," he wrote to her. "If they touch you, they expose their fear." Margaret read the letter, then tore it in half, then burned it to ash. What Reginald did not understand, what he could not understand, was that the king had changed. Once Henry had been dangerous because he believed he was right. Now he was dangerous because he believed he was God, and no God tolerates reminders of his mortal kin.
Margaret's blood, old, royal, and inconvenient, made her less like a subject and more like a secret waiting to rise. The king could not prove she was guilty, but guilt was no longer required, only doubt. And doubt, like ink, spreads without consent. They took her land first quietly, with no notice or explanation, only a clerk's visit and a seal. Then her pension, then her household guards, one by one, stones pulled from the foundation. She asked nothing, protested nothing. Only once, when a local magistrate arrived to inventory her belongings, did she say, "Shall I hand over my shadow as well?" He did not answer.
News arrived in strange ways. The butcher's boy whispered that her cousin had been arrested. A travelling friar said her grandson was in the Tower. A washerwoman claimed she'd seen her family's name on a gallows list. The truth never came by letter, only rumour, only rot. The great Margaret Pole, once countess, once lady-in-waiting, once guardian of princesses, was now an old woman in borrowed lace, waiting for footsteps that never meant safety.
She did not weep, even when they came at night, even when they said nothing, only held the parchment too far from her eyes to read, even when they shackled her wrists. "I have no fear of the Tower," she said. "My family built it." They gave her a cell without a window, not large but precise, the kind of place designed not to punish but to erase.
She prayed, yes, but not for mercy, not even for Reginald. She prayed for Mary, for England, for silence that was not cowardice but choice. The guard changed every few days. Some looked away, some stared too long. One young guard stammered when she thanked him for water. "Do not pity me," she said. "I am not the one who should be afraid." He never returned.
When they brought her food, she ate. When they gave her no candle, she counted her breaths. When they took her shawl, she wrapped herself in memory. The tower had held queens, lovers, martyrs, but she was none of them. She was something worse. She was inconvenient.
Outside, the politics spiraled. Reginald had become a cardinal now, not for ambition, but because the church needed a man whose pain could be weaponized. The Pope sent him to stir Europe against England, and he did. But each sermon he gave, each letter he wrote, was one more nail in his mother's coffin. He did not know, or he knew and could not stop. Either way, the blade had already been drawn.
The Act of Attainder was read in Parliament without her presence. No trial, no testimony, only a list of accusations, vague, cruel, unprovable. That she had conspired with Reginald, that her household had hidden rebels, that her letters contained code. None were true, but truth was not the point. Back in the tower, a priest came to her cell. He did not offer absolution, only a warning. You must prepare, my lady. Margaret looked up and replied, I have been preparing since I was 12.
The morning was grey, the kind of grey that seemed to swallow the world whole. No bird sang in the tower's yard. No laughter echoed against the cold stone walls. Margaret Pole was led from her cell with a quiet dignity that silenced even the guards. Her silver hair was pulled back tight, revealing a face etched with years of endurance, not defeat. Her eyes met those who passed her by, steady, unyielding. She was not a woman broken, but a shadow carved from granite.
The scaffold awaited her like a judge with no mercy. A simple platform of rough-hewn wood, stained by centuries of sacrifice and cruelty. The crowd was sparse, officials, soldiers, a few curious onlookers, with no cheers, no jeers, only the heavy silence of inevitability. Margaret climbed the steps with grace, her hands folded in front, as if holding something invisible, a prayer, a memory, a final act of rebellion. She turned to face the crowd, not to plead or condemn, but to remind them of the blood they would spill. The executioner was young and unsteady. His axe gleamed dully in the morning light, lacking the polish of ceremony, appearing more tool than weapon. Margaret's gaze never faltered. She did not flinch when the blade fell. Once, twice, 3 times. The first strokes were clumsy, jarring in their violence. The crowd gasped, the executioner's hands trembling with each swim. And then, in a cruel twist, the blade shattered, splintering against the unforgiving neck it was meant to sever. A collective shudder passed through the watchers. Margaret smiled faintly, a smile without joy, the smile of a woman who knew that death, like life, could be messy and imperfect. The executioner drew another axe, stronger, sharper. He struck again. This time it was clean, final. Margaret Pole's head fell into the basket, but her spirit, indomitable and immortal, hovered over the scene. The crowd dispersed quickly, but whispers remained. Tales of a woman who faced death like a queen. Tales of a blade that failed her once. Tales that grew into legend, a haunting echo in the halls of power. And so the last Plantagenet's blood mingled with the earth of the tower, but her legacy was not in the flesh that was cut down, but in the memory she carved into history's stone.
Margaret's death did not silence her story. It amplified it. Across England and Europe, whispers spread, not of a traitor, but of a martyr wronged by fear and power. Her bloodline, though severed, became a symbol of resilience in the face of ruthless kings, of dignity amid injustice, and of a woman who carried the weight of a dynasty long after her death.
Reginald Pole's path was marked by exile and sorrow. Made a cardinal by Pope Paul III, he became the Church's weapon against the Tudor heresy. Yet every speech, every letter carried the shadow of his mother's fate. He walked a tightrope between faith and politics, haunted by the price paid by the woman who had once been his world. In his final years, Reginald sought reconciliation for England, for Mary, and for the memory of Margaret. But the scars of betrayal ran deep.
History remembers kings and queens by their crowns and wars, but remembers women like Margaret by their silence and scars. Her execution was a statement not of justice, but of control, not of guilt, but of fear. She was the inconvenient truth in a world desperate for simple stories. And so the tower stands still, its stones soaked with secrets and blood, a monument to those who suffered in the shadows of power.
Margaret Pole's story endures, not in chronicles or court records, but in the quiet strength of memory. Power may claim the body, but memory claims the soul, and the soul, once freed, can never be chained.
May the echoes of history gently guide you into a night of serene and peaceful rest.